He was not supposed to be king. That is where the story begins. Not with the 6 wives, not with the executions, not with the man who remade the religion of an entire country to suit his own desires. With a boy, a second son, a boy who grew up in the shadow of his older brother and who was never, for the first years of his life, expected to be anything more than that shadow. His name was Henry Tudor, born on the 28th of June, 1491, the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the spare, not the heir. His brother Arthur was the heir, Arthur Tudor, named for the legendary king whose return England had been promised, whose golden reign would restore the island to greatness. Arthur was everything a Tudor prince was supposed to be: serious, dignified, carefully educated in the duties of kingship from the moment he could walk. He was married at 15 to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, a princess of the most powerful royal house in Europe. The marriage was a triumph of Tudor diplomacy. England was rising, the Tudors were arriving, and Arthur was going to lead them there. Then Arthur died, April 2nd, 1502, 15 years old, 5 months after his wedding. Of sweating sickness, the physicians said. Of something sudden and merciless, we would say now. He died at Ludlow Castle in Wales, and everything changed. The heir was gone. England needed a new prince, and the new prince was Henry, 10 years old. Suddenly the most important child in England. Suddenly the future of a dynasty. He grew up differently after that, not freely, the opposite of freely. Henry VII, who had fought too hard for his crown to risk losing the line that would carry it forward, kept his remaining son close, very close. Henry lived under constant supervision. He could not ride without attendance. He could not joust, which he loved, because jousting was dangerous, and Henry was now too valuable to risk. He could not be, in the way that young men need to be himself. He was kept, preserved, polished, and he chafed against it. He was, by every account, extraordinary, even as a boy. Thomas More, who knew him young and would later have reason to regret knowing him at all, described the young Henry as a person of exceptional gifts. He was tall, already, at 15, taller than most men around him. He had the red gold hair of his grandmother Elizabeth of York. He could speak Latin and French and some Spanish. He played the lute with genuine skill. He composed music. He was interested in theology, in astronomy, in the new learning of the Renaissance that was transforming the intellectual life of Europe. He could ride. He could joust. He could hunt for hours without tiring. He was, in short, everything a Renaissance prince was supposed to be, and he knew it. Henry VII died on the 21st of April, 1509. Henry was 17 years old, and England exhaled. The old king had been careful and calculating and effective and deeply unpopular. He had accumulated wealth for the crown through methods that his subjects found oppressive. He had been suspicious, closed, a man who trusted very few people and showed affection to fewer. When he died, there was genuine relief, and when his son was proclaimed king, there was genuine joy. Henry VIII rode through the streets of London, and the crowds cheered with the sincerity that royal processions do not always inspire. They saw a golden prince, young, magnificent, generous, brilliant, a king who would be different from his father, a king who would be great. They were right that he would be different. They were not entirely right about what different would mean. He married Catherine of Aragon 6 weeks after becoming king. this required some negotiation. Catherine had been betrothed to Henry since Arthur's death, kept in England in a state of uncertainty that had lasted 7 years, too valuable to send home and too complicated to marry. Henry VII had considered marrying her himself after his own wife died. He had decided against it, and so Catherine had waited 7 years in England, with diminishing funds and diminishing status, and the particular dignity of a woman who refuses to be diminished by circumstances she cannot control. Henry VIII married her quickly. Whether this was genuine affection or political convenience or both is a question the record does not entirely resolve. Probably both. She was 23. He was 17. She was experienced and composed and had survived 7 years of uncertainty with her pride intact. He was brilliant and untested and very young. They suited each other in the beginning. The early years of Henry's reign were years of genuine promise. He was, in those years, a good king. Not perfect. He was already capable of sudden violent rages that frightened those around him. He was already susceptible to flattery in ways that men of his intelligence should have been immune to. He already had the quality that would define his reign, the absolute inability to believe that he could be wrong. But he was also genuinely gifted. He surrounded himself with capable men. Thomas Wolsey, the cardinal who would become the most powerful minister in England, who would manage the practical business of government with extraordinary skill, while Henry hunted and jousted and composed music, and believed himself to be doing the work of a king. Thomas More, the scholar and humanist, whose friendship Henry valued and whose company he sought, riding to More's house at Chelsea unannounced, sitting in the garden, talking for hours about theology and philosophy and the nature of justice. He was that king. In those years, the king who talked about the nature of justice in a garden by the Thames. The problem was the son. There is always, in the story of Henry VIII, the son who did not come. Catherine became pregnant several times. The pregnancies ended in miscarriage, in stillbirth, in infants who lived days or weeks and then did not. One child survived, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516, healthy and alive, and as Henry told the Spanish ambassador with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, a proof that sons would follow. Sons did not follow. Year after year, the son did not come, and Henry began to ask himself the question that would change everything. Why? The answer he arrived at was not a medical answer. It was a theological one. He had sinned, he decided. He had married his brother's wife. The Bible was clear on this matter. Leviticus, if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. He had not been childless. There was Mary. But the sons had not survived. And Henry, who had the kind of mind that can convince itself of anything if the motivation is strong enough, convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was invalid in the eyes of God, that the Pope had been wrong to grant the dispensation that allowed it, that he was not and had never truly been married. This was not only theology. There was also Anne Boleyn, dark-eyed, sharp-minded, the woman who had come to court in the mid-1520s and who had captured Henry's attention in a way that no woman before her had quite managed. She was not the first woman Henry had pursued outside his marriage. He had had mistresses. One of them was Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn. But Anne was different. Anne would not be a mistress. She said so, clearly, directly, in a way that Henry, who was accustomed to getting what he wanted, found maddening and irresistible in equal measure. She wanted marriage or nothing, and Henry, who wanted her, began to want marriage. Catherine refused to accept an annulment. This was, from her perspective, entirely reasonable. She had not sinned. She had not been truly married to Arthur. She said this consistently until the end of her life. The marriage had not been consummated. She was Henry's true wife. She would not say otherwise. And the Pope, who was under significant pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, would not grant the annulment Henry needed. Henry waited, and then Henry stopped waiting. What he did next changed England forever. He broke with Rome. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He dissolved the monasteries. He executed men who disagreed with him. Thomas More, who had sat in the garden at Chelsea and talked about the nature of justice, refused to acknowledge Henry's supremacy over the Church. He was executed in 1535. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, refused. He was executed. The machinery of a state that had been remade to serve one man's will was now capable of executing men for disagreement. And it would get worse. The women came one after another. This is the part of Henry's story that everyone knows. The 6 wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But the rhyme makes it sound orderly. It was not orderly. It was chaos, human chaos, driven by desire and fear and the absolute conviction of a man who could not be wrong. Anne Boleyn became queen in 1533. Henry had waited 7 years for her. 7 years of fighting the Pope. 7 years of dismantling the Church of England piece by piece. And then he had her. She was already pregnant when they married. The child was supposed to be the son. In September of 1533, Anne gave birth. It was a girl, Elizabeth. Henry did not hide his disappointment. The celebrations planned for the birth of a prince were quietly cancelled. Anne had given him a daughter, not the son. What followed was 3 years of tension. Anne argued. She had opinions. She expressed them without apology. Henry had wanted this when she was unattainable. When she was his wife, he found it considerably less appealing. She became pregnant again. The child was lost. Again. The pattern that had destroyed his first marriage was repeating itself. Thomas Cromwell understood his king. He understood what Henry needed, and he set about providing it. The charges against Anne Boleyn were assembled with care: adultery, treason, incest. Most historians believe the charges were false, that Anne Boleyn was executed not because she had committed treason, but because Henry VIII wanted to be free of her. She was executed on the 19th of May, 1536. She died with a composure that her enemies could not deny. Henry wore yellow on the day she died. He was engaged to Jane Seymour before her body was cold. Jane Seymour gave him what Anne could not: a son, Edward. Born on the 12th of October, 1537, Henry wept when he held him, the tears of a man who had waited and schemed and executed and broken his country's religion for this moment. 12 days later, Jane Seymour was dead. Childbed fever. Henry mourned her. She had given him his son and died doing it. He wore black for months. He said she was the wife he had loved best. He did not want to marry again. Not immediately. He was 46 years old. He was not in good health. A jousting accident in 1536 had left him with a leg wound that would never heal. He was in pain, chronic, unrelenting. Pain changes people. It had changed Henry. The rages became more frequent, more violent. The men around him walked in terror. Cromwell arranged the fourth marriage, Anne of Cleves, a German princess. Henry met her at Rochester in January of 1540. He was appalled. She was not what the portrait had suggested. He called her, in private, a Flanders mare. The marriage took place anyway. 6 months later, he dissolved it. Then he arrested Cromwell, the man who had served him for a decade, who had done the dirty work of a reign that required a great deal of dirty work. Arrested in June of 1540, executed in July. Henry signed the warrant and moved on. His fifth wife was Catherine Howard, 19 years old. Henry was 49. She was young and pretty and completely unprepared for what marriage to Henry VIII actually meant. She had a past. Her enemies found it. They brought it to Henry. And Henry, who had loved her with the desperate intensity of an old man clinging to youth, felt that love turn cold. Catherine Howard was executed in February of 1542. She was perhaps 20 years old. She asked that the block be brought to her room the night before so she could practice placing her head on it correctly. She was 20 years old, practicing her execution. Catherine Parr was the sixth, the last, 31 years old, married twice before, intelligent, careful. She had seen what happened to the women who were not careful. She survived. When Henry died, she was still his wife. The only one of the six who could say that. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January, 1547. He was 55 years old. The body that was carried from Whitehall told the whole story. Not the story of the Golden Prince, not the story of the man who could joust and compose music and debate theology with the finest minds in Europe. The story of what power does to a person when nothing and no one can stop it. He had been enormous at the end. The armour made for him in his youth and the armour made for him in his final decade exist side by side in museums today. The waist that had been 32 inches in his youth was 54 inches at his death. He had been carried in a chair in his final months. His legs could not support his weight. His leg wound, which had never properly healed since the jousting accident of 1536, had ulcerated continuously. He had been in constant pain, for years, pain that no physician of the era could adequately treat, pain that had shaped his final years as surely as anything he had decided or chosen. He died in the early morning, in his bed, surrounded by attendants, being afraid to tell him he was dying, because telling Henry VIII something he did not want to hear was still, even at the very end, a dangerous thing to do. He left behind 3 children: Edward, 9 years old, Mary, 31, Elizabeth, 13. He left behind a church that was neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant, suspended between the two in the deliberate ambiguity of the Elizabethan settlement that his daughter would eventually create from the mess he had made. He left behind a treasury depleted by wars and by the extraordinary expense of being Henry VIII. He left behind monasteries dissolved and their wealth dispersed and their communities scattered, and centuries of religious life simply ended by royal decree. He left behind men who were dead because they had disagreed with him. Thomas More, who had been his friend, who had ridden to Chelsea and sat in the garden and talked about justice, who had refused to say that Henry was the supreme head of the Church of England, and had been executed for the refusal: John Fisher, Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and dozens of others whose names do not appear in the history books, who died in the machinery of a state that had been remade to serve one man's will. The question that remains is the one that historians have been arguing about since before Henry was cold. What was he? A tyrant, certainly. By any reasonable definition of the word, Henry VIII was a tyrant. He executed people for disagreeing with him. He remade the law to serve his personal desires. He dissolved institutions that had existed for centuries without consulting anyone who might have objected. He was capable of ordering the death of people he had loved. He did order the death of people he had loved. By any reasonable definition, that is tyranny. But there is always a but with Henry VIII. The Church of England. Whatever you think of the reasons it was created, whatever you think of the violence and the dishonesty that attended its creation, the Church of England exists. It has shaped the religious and cultural life of England for 5 centuries. It exists because Henry VIII wanted an annulment, and the Pope would not give him one. That is an uncomfortable origin story, but it is the origin story. Elizabeth I, his daughter, the daughter he had declared illegitimate, the daughter of the woman he had executed, who became one of the most remarkable monarchs in English history, who built the Elizabethan settlement that gave England a form of religious life it could live with, who defeated the Spanish Armada, who presided over the flowering of English literature and theatre and music that produced Shakespeare and Marlowe, and the culture that the world still reads and watches and studies. She was Henry's daughter. She had his intelligence and his stubbornness and his absolute refusal to be diminished by the people around her. She had also something Henry did not have. The understanding that power is not simply the ability to destroy, that the most durable power is the power that people choose to give you. She learned this partly from watching what her father's power had cost. There is a portrait of Henry VIII that most people know. Hans Holbein the Younger painted it in the late 1530s. Henry stands facing the viewer directly, legs apart, hands at his sides, the stance of a man who takes up space deliberately, who wants you to understand, before he says a word, that this is his space, and you are in it at his pleasure. The face is the face of middle age, not yet the ravaged face of the final years, but not the golden face of the young king either. It is the face of a man who has gotten most of what he wanted and has discovered that wanting and having are not the same thing. The eyes are small and close together. They look out at you with the particular quality of someone who is always calculating, always measuring, always asking of everyone they see, what are you to me and what can you do and what are you worth? It is not a comfortable face. It is not supposed to be. He was, in the end, a man of his time in the most extreme possible sense. The qualities that made him extraordinary were the qualities of his era, magnified by power and intelligence, and the particular accident of being born a king's son at a moment when everything was changing. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the printing press, the new world across the ocean. Everything was in motion. Everything was being questioned. The old certainties were failing and new ones had not yet arrived. And into this moment walked Henry Tudor, who had his own certainties, who had in fact nothing but certainties, who was incapable of real doubt, who could not in the end believe that he was wrong about anything. Not about Catherine, not about Anne, not about the church, Not about the men he executed, not about any of it. He died, almost certainly, convinced that he had done what God required of him, that the marriages had been necessary, that the executions had been just, that the church he had created was the church God had always intended England to have. He died convinced, which is perhaps the most frightening thing about him. Not the executions, not the wives, not the weight and the pain and the terror he inspired in the people around him, but the conviction, the absolute, unshakable, lifelong conviction that Henry VIII was right about everything, always. England survived him. That is not nothing. Countries do not always survive their tyrants. England did. It came out the other side of Henry's reign changed in ways that could not be reversed and would not be reversed, carrying the church he had created and the children he had produced, and the particular combination of wounds and gifts that his 38 years on the throne had left behind. Edward came next, then Mary, then Elizabeth. And Elizabeth built something from the wreckage and the possibility that her father had left her, something that lasted, something that mattered, something that Henry, for all his certainty, had not been able to predict or plan or control. The future, which is always, in the end, beyond the reach of even the most powerful hands. This has been Dark Chronicle, the story of Henry VIII, the king who changed everything, and the man who could never admit he was wrong. Subscribe for more stories from history's darkest corners.